The Millionaire and the Maid. He was a millionaire accustomed to having everything and wanted just one night with his new maid. But she, virginal and mysterious, refused any advances, leaving him disconcerted. The game of seduction turned into a torment when he realized she touched parts of him that no one had ever reached. What began as desire turned into obsession and ended in a love he never imagined feeling. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. Richard Morrison looked out the window of his penthouse apartment, watching the New York City skyline disappear beneath the evening lights. He swirled the imported red wine in his glass, feeling the familiar boredom that always assaulted him after closing another million-dollar deal. At 38, he was the face of American business success. Son of a traditional family, he had multiplied his inheritance with talent and relentless ambition. Financial newspapers called him the contemporary Midas, a nickname that fed his ego but didn't fill the emptiness growing inside him. His cell phone vibrated. It was Deborah, his secretary. "Mr. Morrison, the candidates for the housekeeper position are here for interviews." Richard sighed. The turnover of employees in his home was high. He demanded perfection and rarely found anyone who satisfied him. The luxurious party's unpredictable schedule and his volatile temperament drove away even the most dedicated workers. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. He adjusted his impeccable Italian suit and descended in his private elevator. In the waiting room, 3 women were waiting. He immediately recognized 2 of them as the usual profile. Professionals with experience in high-end homes, impeccably dressed, extensive resumes. The third, however, stood out completely. Sitting discreetly in the corner, she wore a simple navy blue dress without jewelry or flashy makeup. Her brown hair was tied in an unpretentious bun. On her lap was a book of poems by Walt Whitman with colorful bookmarks and a small worn leather suitcase beside her. While the other candidates observed the environment with obvious admiration, she seemed to be elsewhere, absorbed in distant thoughts. Richard observed her for a few seconds before introducing himself. There was something about her that intrigued him. It wasn't conventional beauty, although she was naturally pretty without artifice, but a kind of silent presence that seemed to occupy the space effortlessly. "Let's begin the interviews," he announced, indicating the meeting room. The first 2 candidates were predictable. Experience in Westchester County mansions, references from influential families, total availability. Richard listened to them distantly, asking mechanical questions. When Hannah Adams entered, something in the atmosphere changed. "Why do you want to work here, Miss Adams?" She looked at him with calm brown eyes without the intimidation or fascination he usually provoked. "I need a stable job for at least a year. I'm saving money to finish my literature degree. I read that you travel frequently, which would give me time to study during the evenings." Her honesty disconcerted Richard. No attempt to impress him, no compliments about his mansion or career. "You don't have experience in houses like mine. I worked as a housekeeper for the Wilson family for 3 years while starting college. Then I had to interrupt my studies when my mother fell ill and I returned to my hometown. Now I'm starting over." "Why not look for something related to literature, maybe a bookstore?" "The hours wouldn't allow me to study properly. As a housekeeper, I can better organize my time during the periods when you're away." Richard leaned back in his chair, intrigued. She planned to use his space as mere convenience for her own objectives. It was unusual, irritating, and somehow refreshing. "What are you reading?" he asked, pointing to the book she still carried. For a moment, he saw her face transform. A genuine sparkle illuminated her eyes. "Whitman. I'm rereading Leaves of Grass. There are poems there that seem to speak directly to our time, even though they were written decades ago." "Quote one," he challenged, more to prolong the conversation than out of real interest. Hannah hesitated briefly, then closed her eyes and recited, "The untold want, by life and land ne'er granted, now, voyager, sail thou forth to seek and find." A strange silence hung between them. Richard felt an inexplicable discomfort, as if those verses had been chosen specifically for him, for the empty nights after his exuberant parties. "You're hired," he said abruptly. "Deborah will show you the accommodations and explain your duties. You start tomorrow." Hannah seemed surprised but nodded, simply. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Morrison." In the days that followed, Richard found himself discreetly observing Hannah. While working, she maintained her own routine, almost ritualistic. She woke before dawn and did yoga in the garden. During the day, she executed her tasks with silent efficiency. In the evening, she sat on the small balcony of her staff room with a cup of tea and her eternal poetry book. She wasn't impressed by the celebrities who frequented his parties, nor by the expensive gifts he distributed to the women who passed through his life. When she served the guests, she was polite and invisible at the same time, a skill that irritated Richard, accustomed to being the center of attention. "Why don't you ever participate in conversations during events?" he asked one night after everyone had left. Hannah, who was collecting the last glasses, responded without raising her eyes. "I have nothing to add, sir. I'm here to work, not to socialize." "And if I asked for your opinion on something?" She finally looked at him. "It would depend on the subject." Richard smiled, feeling strangely challenged. "Opinion on my investment choices. I don't understand finance. On the wines in my cellar? I only drink tea. On the people who attend my parties." Hannah hesitated, and for a moment Richard saw something in her eyes, perhaps judgment, perhaps pity. "It's not my place to judge how you choose to live your life or with whom you decide to share it." That response, more than any direct criticism, deeply bothered Richard. There was dignity in this woman who seemed impenetrable to his charm, wealth, and power, the three weapons he had always used to get what he wanted. That night, lying in his king-size bed with a view of the illuminated city, Richard made an impulsive decision. In 3 weeks, he would make Hannah surrender to his charm. It would be just another conquest, a challenge to prove to himself that no one was beyond his reach. What he didn't expect was that in trying to bend her, he would be the one who would begin to transform. The next morning, for the first time in years, Richard woke at sunrise. From his bedroom window, he observed Hannah in her morning yoga practice. There was a peace in her that he had never experienced. For a moment, he felt like an intruder, observing something precious and private. When she opened her eyes and looked directly at his window, Richard instinctively retreated, like a child caught in mischief. Richard's strategy to win Hannah over began subtly. First, small changes in his routine, longer breakfasts, questions about literature that required answers beyond monosyllables, invitations for her to join him for dinner when there were no guests. Hannah responded politely, but maintained the professional distance that frustrated him so much. "You never smile?" he asked one morning as she served coffee. Hannah looked at him for a moment. "I smile when there's reason to, Mr. Morrison." "And I'm not reason enough?" The question came out in the charming tone that usually worked with other women. "You are my employer." The simplicity of the response was like a wall between them. In the second week, Richard changed tactics. He discovered, through Deborah, that Hannah was trying to get a rare edition of Emily Dickinson that would be essential for her thesis. That same afternoon, he bought the book and left it on her bed, without a note or explanation. When he returned from the office, he found the book on his bedside table with a small card. "I appreciate the kindness, but I cannot accept personal gifts. Respect means recognizing boundaries. Hannah." The rejection, instead of pushing him away, only intensified his determination. Richard wasn't used to hearing no. In his 38 years, he had always gotten what he wanted, whether $1 million contract or an attractive woman. Hannah was an enigma that challenged his worldview. One night, after a particularly exhausting business dinner, Richard returned home earlier than expected. He found Hannah in the winter garden, illuminated only by the soft light of an antique lamp, completely absorbed in her book. She didn't notice him immediately, and he took the opportunity to observe her. There was something hypnotic about the way her delicate fingers turned the pages, how her eyes sparkled with each verse, how her lips sometimes moved silently, savoring the words. "What makes it so special?" he asked, finally announcing his presence. Hannah startled, closing the book in an almost protective gesture. "What? That book? You carry it everywhere, like a talisman." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the invasion of her privacy, but something in Richard's genuinely curious expression made her answer. "It was a gift from my grandmother before she passed away. She taught me to love literature when I was a child." Hannah caressed the worn cover with an affection Richard had never seen directed at any of his expensive possessions. "Each time I reread it, I find something new. It's like an ongoing conversation with those who are gone, and with parts of myself I'm still discovering." That was the first time Richard saw Hannah truly vulnerable, and something stirred inside him. It wasn't just desire, it was a kind of fascination. How could someone find so much meaning in something as simple as an old book? "May I see it?" he asked, extending his hand. Surprisingly, she handed over the book, watching him attentively as he leafed through the yellowed pages, noticing the small annotations in the margins, made in delicate handwriting. "You underline your books?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Only this one. It's like a diary. Each time I reread it, I mark passages that seem to speak directly to the moment I'm living." Richard stopped at a page where a verse was circled several times. "Not I nor anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it by yourself." "And this one, why is it so marked?" Hannah smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed her. "Because it's about change, about recognizing when it's time to leave behind what limits us, even if it's comfortable." Something in the way she said that made Richard feel exposed, as if she could see through the layers of success and arrogance he had cultivated over the years. "Do you think I would need a verse like that?" he asked, trying to regain control of the conversation. Hannah looked him directly in the eyes. "All of us at some point." The next morning, Richard cancelled all appointments and spent the day at the mansion, something unprecedented in his routine. He observed Hannah work, moving with grace and efficiency. In the afternoon, he sat on the veranda with an economics book he had never finished reading, just to be near while she tended the garden. "Why are you really here?" Hannah asked finally, while watering the orchids. "You never stay home during the day." "It's my home. I can be wherever I want." "Yes, but there's always a purpose behind your actions, Mr. Morrison. Always a strategy." Richard smiled, admiring her insight. "Maybe I'm tired of strategies. Maybe I just want to be." Hannah studied him for a moment. Be who? The question caught him off guard. Who was he, really, beyond the successful executive, the relentless seducer, the heir who had multiplied the family fortune? For the first time in years, Richard found himself without an answer. In the evening, during the dinner, he had insisted they share in the kitchen, another unprecedented behavior. Richard tried a more direct approach. "Hannah, I feel there's something between us." She placed her fork delicately on the plate. "What's between us is a professional relationship, Mr. Morrison. I am your employee. And if I wanted more, then you would be disrespecting the agreement we made when you hired me. People don't choose who they fall in love with." Hannah looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and firmness. "This isn't love, Mr. Morrison, it's habit. You're accustomed to getting everything you want. I'm just a challenge, something that didn't immediately fall at your feet." Her frankness hit him like a slap. "You don't know me well enough to make that kind of judgment. I know enough. I've seen how you treat the women who pass through your life, how you discard them when you get bored, how your assistants tremble when you're in a bad mood, how your employees talk about your unpredictable temper." She took a deep breath. "I respect your space and your work. I ask the same in return." Richard felt a growing anger, not from the rejection, but from the truth her words carried. "And if I'm genuinely interested in you, if it's not just a whim?" Hannah surprised him again. "Then prove it. Not with gifts or grand gestures, but with time, with genuine respect." The next day, Richard left early for the office and returned late at night. He avoided Hannah in the days that followed, feeling strangely embarrassed, an emotion he hadn't experienced since adolescence. On the rare occasions when they crossed paths, he was polite but distant. Something had changed inside him, and that frightened him more than any financial crisis he had ever faced. In the third week, when his deadline to win her over was ending, Richard did something he had never done before. He invited Hannah to accompany him to a charity event as his personal assistant, not as a date. It was a way to have her nearby without disrespecting the boundaries she had established. To his surprise, she accepted. On the night of the event, wearing a simple but elegant dress, Hannah discreetly accompanied him, observing everything with attentive and curious eyes. During the charity auction, Richard impulsively made a winning bid on a literacy program for underprivileged communities. The amount was substantial even by his standards. On the way back, Hannah broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" "What?" "Donated so much money to the literacy project. Your bid was 3 times higher than the previous one." Richard reflected for a moment. "Maybe because for the first time I thought about the real impact that money could have. How many people could discover worlds in books like you did?" Hannah looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "I hope you're sincere." When they arrived at the mansion, Richard accompanied her to the door of her quarters. There was no attempt at a kiss or invitation to extend the evening, just a "thank you for accompanying me" that sounded surprisingly genuine even to himself. That night, lying in his bed, Richard realized that the deadline he had established to win Hannah over had ended, and he had failed, or perhaps in some mysterious way had begun to triumph over himself. The next morning he didn't find Hannah in her morning yoga practice. Her room was empty, the bed made. On the pillow, an envelope and the poetry book she always carried with her. Richard stared at the envelope with his heart racing. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, something unprecedented for a man accustomed to maintaining control in any situation. Hannah's letter was brief but impactful. "Mr. Morrison, I thank you for the employment opportunity, but I must leave. There are boundaries that once crossed cannot be restored. I leave with you my most precious book, not as a gift, but as a loan. Perhaps you will find in it answers that I wouldn't know how to give. Hannah." Richard leafed through the book, noticing a page where she had recently underlined, "Keep your face always toward the sunshine, and shadows will fall behind you." For the first time in years, Richard felt an emptiness that no successful business or conquest could fill. It wasn't just desire or wounded pride, it was something deeper, as if a part of him that had been dormant for years had awakened only to discover that what it was looking for had just left. That same morning, he summoned his private security team to locate Hannah. He discovered that she had returned to college and now worked part-time in a small flower shop in Greenwich Village, New York. The establishment, called Petals and Poetry, combined flowers and books, a unique concept that seemed just like her. Richard drove there personally, something he would never do under normal circumstances. He parked his Porsche discreetly a few blocks away and walked through the busy streets, feeling strangely anonymous among ordinary people. The flower shop was welcoming, with walls covered in climbing plants and shelves of used books organized by genre. In the center, Hannah was animatedly conversing with an elderly lady about the meaning of flowers in a bouquet she was arranging. She didn't see him immediately, and Richard took the opportunity to observe her in that environment that seemed a natural extension of her, colorful, alive, full of subtle meanings. When their gazes finally crossed, her smile gradually disappeared. There was no anger in her eyes, only contained sadness that hit him more deeply than any direct reproach. "We need to talk," he said, approaching after the customer walked away. "There's nothing to say, Mr. Morrison." "Richard. My name is Richard." "That doesn't change anything. Why did you leave like that without saying goodbye?" Hannah sighed. "Because any goodbye would have complicated something that needed to be simple. I was hired to work, not to become emotionally involved." "And did you become involved?" The question came out more vulnerable than he intended. Their eyes met briefly, before she looked away. "Does that matter now?" "To me, it does." "Then maybe that's the problem. It's always about what matters to you, isn't it? Your desires, your achievements, your whims." Richard felt the impact of the words, but there wasn't the usual irritation he felt when contradicted. There was only clarity, painful but necessary. "I came to return your book," he said, extending the volume carefully. Hannah hesitated before taking it. "Thank you." "And to ask for a chance." "A chance for what?" "To show that I can be more than what you've seen so far." She shook her head gently. "People don't change overnight, Richard, especially when they've spent their entire lives being rewarded for their behavior." At that moment, the door of the flower shop opened and an elegant woman entered, accompanied by photographers. Richard recognized her immediately. Victoria Mills, a socialite with whom he had a brief relationship the previous year. She saw him and smiled predatorily. "Richard Morrison, what a surprise to find you in such a quaint place." Her gaze swept over Hannah and the shop with barely disguised condescension. "I didn't know you liked flowers, or perhaps you're here for other interests." She cast a meaningful look at Hannah. Before Richard could respond, the photographers began to flash their cameras. Hannah moved away uncomfortably, returning behind the counter. "Victoria, this isn't a good time," said Richard, tense. "Oh, darling, all moments are good for publicity. By the way, we need to talk about that investment you promised for my foundation." Hannah's eyes met Richard's, a look of painful understanding on her face, as if all her suspicions about him had just been confirmed. "Please leave." "This is a private establishment," Hannah said firmly, surprising everyone. Victoria laughed. "Darling, do you know who I am?" "Yes, someone who is disturbing my workplace. Please leave." Richard observed Hannah with admiration. She wasn't intimidated, neither by his wealth before, nor by Victoria's status now. "Let's go, Victoria," said Richard, leading her outside along with the photographers. Outside, he quickly ended the conversation with the socialite and returned to the flower shop, but Hannah was no longer at the counter. A colleague informed him that she had left through the back door and wouldn't return for the rest of the day. The next day, headlines about Richard Morrison appeared in all the tabloids. Business magnate swapped socialites for florist? The photos showed fragments of the encounter, with malicious insinuations about Hannah. What disturbed Richard most, however, was a secondary story that began circulating on social media, revealing old harassment cases in his companies that had been hushed up with financial settlements. The press that had always flattered him now devoured him. Shareholders demanded explanations. Business partners expressed concern about associating their brands with his image. His public relations team suggested an exclusive interview to control the damage, a strategy that had always worked in the past. But for the first time, Richard refused to follow the usual script. He didn't give interviews, didn't issue official statements, didn't sue the media outlets. Instead, he fired the lawyers who had conducted the silence agreements and hired a consultancy specialized in corporate ethics to review all company policies. In his empty mansion, Richard spent nights rereading Hannah's book, discovering in those underlined verses parts of her, and surprisingly parts of himself, that he had ignored for years. Driven by a feeling he couldn't name, Richard began to investigate Hannah's past. He discovered that she came from Clearwater Springs, a small town in upstate New York. He traveled there discreetly, staying in a simple inn, something unthinkable months before. In the town, he spoke with former neighbors and Hannah's teachers. He discovered that her parents had been teachers dedicated to education in rural areas. Her mother had fallen seriously ill, forcing Hannah to abandon college to care for her. After her death, the family home had been sold to pay medical debts and the land was abandoned. Richard visited the site, a large space where only the foundations of the old house remained, surrounded by a wild garden that still flourished even without care. He sat there for hours, imagining Hannah growing up in that place among books and flowers. On the way back to New York, an idea began to form in his mind. It wouldn't be a grand gesture to impress her. It would be something deeper, more meaningful. In the months that followed, Richard transformed in ways that surprised everyone around him. He sold 3 of his 5 luxury cars, dismissed his personal security team, and began attending therapy sessions, something he had always dismissed as stuff for the weak. His nights, previously filled with exclusive parties and fleeting encounters, were now dedicated to anonymous volunteer work in shelters for people in vulnerable situations. There he learned to listen to life stories that no MBA could teach, stories of resilience, daily struggles, small victories that were worth more than any million-dollar deal. In his company, he implemented structural changes that were initially viewed with skepticism, but gradually transformed the corporate culture. He created an independent reporting channel, revised the salary policy to eliminate gender and race disparities, implemented extended parental leave programs, and established a continuing education fund for employees. The land in Clearwater Springs was discreetly purchased through a foundation. Architects and builders were hired to erect a community educational center on the site, with a library, computer lab, multi-purpose rooms, and a large sensory garden. The project was named Adams Cultural Center, in honor of Hannah's parents. Richard personally supervised each stage of the project, traveling bi-weekly to the small town. The locals found it strange this businessman who arrived without fanfare, often driving his own car, and who sat with the workers to share lunch and listen to their stories. In New York, Richard occasionally passed by the flower shop, always discreetly, just to observe Hannah from afar. He never tried to approach her directly, respecting the space she had asked for. Instead, he sent a small arrangement of Native American flowers to the shop weekly, always accompanied by a verse from the book she had lent him. He never signed the cards, but he knew she would recognize the words. The inauguration of the cultural center was scheduled to coincide with the town's anniversary. Richard planned every detail, making sure the event would be about the community and the Adams family legacy, not about him or his company. There would be no corporate logos, speeches by authorities, or any element that would turn that moment into a marketing opportunity. On the eve of the inauguration, while supervising the final details, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Marianne, Hannah's colleague at the flower shop. "She knows," she said simply. "Hannah found out about the cultural center." Richard's heart raced. How did she find out? A customer at the flower shop is from Clearwater Springs. He recognized her surname on the event posters and commented about the New York businessman who was building something in honor of her family. Marianne paused. She was very shaken, Richard. At first she thought it was some kind of cruel joke. Then, when she confirmed it was true, she remained silent for hours. "Where is she now?" "She took the first bus to Clearwater Springs this morning. Said she needed to see it with her own eyes." Richard thanked her for the information and hung up, feeling a mixture of anxiety and hope. He hadn't planned for Hannah to discover the project this way, much less before the official inauguration. Now everything was out of his control, a sensation he was still getting used to. That night, as he walked through the nearly completed cultural center, Richard spotted a familiar silhouette in the garden. Hannah was standing in front of a rose bush that had been transplanted from her family's old garden, the only original part that had survived. He approached slowly, giving her time to notice his presence. When their gazes finally met, there was no accusation in her eyes, only a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't completely decipher. "Why?" she asked simply. Richard took a deep breath. "It's not an attempt to impress you, if that's what you're thinking." "Then what is it?" "A way to learn to give without expecting anything in return. To do something that will last longer than myself." Hannah carefully observed his face as if looking for signs of falsehood. "How did you know about the land? About my family's history?" "I came here a few months ago. I talked to people who knew your parents. I heard stories about how they transformed lives through education." A silence established itself between them, filled only by the night sounds of the garden. Hannah walked through the space, touching the walls, observing every detail. "You didn't put your name on anything." It's not about me. It's always been about you, Richard. Every achievement, every acquisition, every person in your life, it's always been about increasing your empire or your ego. The words hurt, but he didn't deny them. You're right. It was like that for a long time. Maybe it still is in part. I'm learning. Hannah approached a wall where old photographs of her parents with students had been framed. Her fingers gently touched the glass. How did you get these photos? Your former neighbor, Mrs. Cecilia, kept an album that was left behind when the house was sold. She hoped that one day you would return to claim it. Hannah let escape a contained sob, the first sign of vulnerability that Richard had witnessed. By instinct, he took a step in her direction, but restrained himself, respecting her space. I'm not asking you to forgive me or accept me back into your life, he said softly. I just wanted to do something that really mattered, something that would honor people who lived with purpose like your parents. Hannah looked at him, her eyes bright with contained tears. You really have changed, haven't you? I'm trying. Every day. The next morning, the Adams Cultural Center was inaugurated with a simple ceremony. Children from the community cut the ribbon, and the doors were opened for everyone to explore the new space. Richard remained discreetly in the background, observing the expressions of joy and curiosity as people discovered the library, classrooms, and computer lab. At the moment of the inaugural speech, Richard was called to the improvised stage. He hesitated, then saw Hannah among the crowd, nodding slightly. With uncertain steps, he approached the microphone. I'm not good with words like Hannah Adams, he began, provoking smiles among those who knew the young woman. But I learned from her that sometimes we need to borrow others' words when our own aren't enough. He took the poetry book, now carefully covered, from his pocket and opened it to a marked page. This center isn't about building a structure, but about honoring a legacy. As the poet says, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. This place was planted long before its walls were erected. It was planted by the Adams teachers in the lives they touched. As he finished his brief speech, Richard realized something he had never felt before, the deep satisfaction of being part of something greater than himself, without being the center of attention. The applause wasn't for him, but for what that space represented. In the weeks that followed, Hannah agreed to coordinate the center's reading incentive program on weekends, dividing her time between the flower shop in New York and her hometown. Richard supported her from a distance, providing resources without interfering in her decisions. A respectful professional relationship established itself between them, punctuated by increasingly long conversations about literature, education, and social transformation. Meanwhile, Richard's business empire faced turbulence. The scandal about the harassment cases had affected investor confidence, and his recent changes in corporate culture were viewed with suspicion by more traditional executives. In a tense board meeting, it was suggested that he temporarily step aside to rehabilitate his image. For the first time, Richard didn't fight to maintain absolute control. Instead, he proposed a restructuring of leadership, sharing power with a diverse team of executives committed to ethical practices. He would remain as chairman of the board, but with shared powers and new governance policies. Are you giving up everything you've built? Questioned his lawyer, incredulous. I'm building something different, replied Richard. Something that can last beyond my name. On a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the inauguration of the center, Richard found Hannah in the sensory garden. Children ran among the plants, discovering textures and aromas, while elderly people rested on benches, sharing stories. There was a pulsating life in that space that went beyond the carefully planned architecture. I brought something for you, he said, handing her a small package. Hannah opened it, revealing a first edition of Leaves of Grass by Whitman. Her eyes widened. This must have cost a fortune. Richard smiled. Actually, I traded it for one of my collector's watches. I thought time would be worth more inside these pages than on my wrist. Hannah laughed, a sound he had learned to value more than any corporate applause. They walked through the garden, talking about the center's new projects, about the books they were reading, about the small transformations in their lives. When they reached a bench under a crabapple tree, Hannah hesitated before sitting. "I have something to tell you." The serious tone worried him. "What is it?" "I received an invitation for a PhD in literature. It's a special program for educators who work in social projects." "That's wonderful," exclaimed Richard, genuinely happy for her. "It's in England. It would last 2 years. Richard felt a tightness in his chest but smiled anyway. "You should go. It's a unique opportunity." "But the centre, the projects we started, will continue. Here, you've formed an amazing team and England isn't so far." Hannah studied him for a moment. "The old Richard would have tried to stop me, or used his money to bring the program to the US. He laughed softly. The old Richard was a controlling idiot. And the new one, still learning to let go, to respect that some people and experiences aren't possessions, but temporary gifts in our lives. Their gazes met, and something changed. In the atmosphere between them, it wasn't the superficial magnetism of the early days, but something deeper, built on mutual respect and genuine transformation. "And if," Hannah hesitated, "and if I didn't want it to be just temporary?" Richard's heart accelerated. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like you to wait for me, that we continue building this, not just the center, but what exists between us." Under the crabapple tree, their lips met for the first time, not as employer and employee, not as benefactor and beneficiary, but as two human beings discovering, together, a new path. The 2 years in England passed faster than they imagined. Richard traveled monthly to visit her, experiencing a new country through her eyes. In New York, he continued his personal and business transformation, facing resistance, but gradually building a different legacy than he had originally planned. When Hannah returned, she brought not only her doctorate but also the news of a 4-month pregnancy. The daughter was born the following spring, Aurora, a name chosen to symbolize the new beginning they had built together. The wedding took place in the garden of the Adams Cultural Center, with the entire community participating in the celebration. There was no ostentatious luxury or expensive gifts, just the genuine presence of people who had witnessed the transformation of both. During the vows, Richard took from his pocket the old poetry book that she had once left as a loan. "You lent me words when mine weren't enough. You lent me purpose when I only had ambition. You lent me your vision of the world when mine was limited. Today, I promise not only to return, but to multiply everything you taught me." Hannah with E. Aurora in her arms smiled through tears. "And I promise to continue believing in your capacity for transformation, as I believed that day when I saw something in your eyes that you hadn't even discovered yourself yet." Years later, the mansion that had once been a status symbol transformed into a space for community meetings and educational programs. The couple lived in a smaller, cozier house where the old piano from the mansion occupied a prominent place in the living room. On special nights, Hannah played the same music that Richard had heard her play the day she left. But now, instead of farewell, it was celebration. On one of those nights, as he watched his wife playing piano and his daughter drawing concentratedly on the living room rug, Richard reflected on how his pursuit of success had changed. It was no longer measured by figures or applause, but by moments like that, of full presence, shared purpose, and love built patiently. Aurora approached, offering him a flower picked from the garden. "For you, Daddy." Richard received it like a treasure, thinking about how that simple daisy was worth more than all the possessions he had ever accumulated. Because that flower, like the love that now filled his life, couldn't be bought. Only cultivated with care, patience, and authenticity. The transformation hadn't been instantaneous or perfect. There were relapses, doubts, moments of wounded pride, but each step, however small, had taken him closer to a version of himself that finally made sense, not for the grandeur of his achievements, but for the depth of his connections. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard and Hannah's journey has touched your hearts. To continue on this journey of emotions, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here, clicking on the left. If this narrative of transformation and true love awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe. to our channel and give this video a like. Daily we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and the possibilities of genuine change. What would you do in Richard or Hannah's place? Tell us in the comments and share.